The Second Interment by Clark Ashton Smith, originally published 1933. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. "Well," said Guy Magbane, "I notice that you're still alive." His curtain-shadowed lips, as they shaped the words, took on a thin, ambiguous curve that might have been either smile or sneer. He came forward, peering a little obliquely at the sick man, and held out the glass of garnet-colored medicine. Sir Uther Magbane, sitting amid the heavy pillows like a death's head with tawny hair and blue eyes, made no answer and appeared to hesitate before accepting the glass. A dark, formless terror seemed to float upward in his pale gaze, like a drowned object that rises slowly in some autumnal weir. Finally, he took the glass and drained its contents with a convulsive gulp, as if the act of swallowing were difficult. "I'm pretty sick this time, Guy," he said in a voice that some inner constraint or actual physical constriction had rendered harshly guttural and toneless. "But the worst fear is that I may not be sick enough, that the thing may happen again as it did before. My God, I can't think of anything else. I can't imagine anything else but the black, suffocating agony, the blind, intolerable, stifling horror of it. Promise me again, Guy, that you'll defer my burial for at least a fortnight, for a month, and swear that when you do put me away, you'll make sure that the push button and electric wiring in my casket are in good order. Merciful God, supposing I should wake up in the tomb and find that the alarm didn't work." "Don't worry, I'll attend to all that." The tone was soothing, a little contemptuous, and to the listener, touched with a sinister meaning. Guy Magbane turned to leave the room and did not see that the floating fear in his brother's gaze had become, for the moment, a palpable, recognizable thing. He added over his shoulder negligently and without looking back, "That idea has grown to be a regular obsession with you. Just because the thing occurred once doesn't mean it will ever occur again. If you die this time, you'll stay dead in all likelihood. There won't be any more mistakes about it." With this equivocal and dubious reassurance, he went out and closed the door behind him. Sir Uther Magbane leaned back among the pillows and stared at the somber oaken wainscoting. He felt, as he had felt ever since the beginning of his present illness, that the room was too cramped and narrow, that the walls were always threatening to close in upon him, the roof to descend above him like the sides and lid of a coffin. He could never seem to draw a full breath. All he could do was to lie there, alone with his ghastly fear, his hideous memories, and his even more hideous apprehensions. The visits of his younger brother, Guy, for some time past, had served merely to strengthen his feeling of sepulchral oppression, for Guy was now part of the fear. He had always been afraid of death, even in his boyhood, that time when the specter should normally be dim and far away, if perceived at all. It had begun with the early death of his mother. Ever since that black bereavement, a hovering, vulturine shadow had seemed to taint and darken the things that were unspoiled for others. His imagination, morbidly acute, sick with suspicion of life itself, had seen everywhere the indwelling skeleton, the flower-shrouded corpse. The kisses of young love were flavored with mortality. The very sap of things was touched with putrefaction. With heartfelt shudders, as he matured, He had nourished his charnel fancy on all that was macabre in art and literature. Like a seer who gazes into a black crystal, he foresaw with harrowing minuteness the physical and mental agonies of dissolution. He previsioned the activities of decay, the slow toil of the mordant worm, as clearly as if he had descended into the tomb's loathsome oblivion. But he had not imagined or feared the most poignant horror of all, that of premature burial, until he had himself experienced it. The thing had come without warning, just after his succession to the estate and his engagement to Alice Margreave, in whose love he had begun to forget a little his boyhood terrors. It was as if the haunting spectre had retired, only to strike in a more abhorrent and appalling shape. Lying there now, the memory seemed to stop his very heart, to throttle his breathing as it always did. Again, with hallucinatory distinctness, he recalled the first gradual attack of his mysterious malady. He recalled the beginning of his syncope, the lightless gulf into which he had gone down by timeless degrees, as if through infinite empty space. Somewhere in that gulf he had found oblivion, the black instant that might have been hours or ages, from which he had awakened in darkness, had tried to sit up, and had bruised his face against an adamantine obstruction that seemed to be only a few inches above him. He had struck out, blindly, in mad, insensate panic, trying to thresh about with hands and feet, and had met on all sides a hard, unyielding surface, more terrifying because of its inexplicable nearness than the walls of some nighted oubliette. There was a period of nightmare confusion, and then he knew what had happened. By some ghastly mistake he had been placed, still alive, in a casket, and the casket was in the old vaults of his family below the chapel floor. He began to scream then, and his screams, with the dull, muffled repercussion of some underground explosion, were hurled back upon him appallingly in the narrow space. Already the air seemed to stifle him, thick with mortuary odors of wood and cloth. Hysteria seized him, and he went quite mad, hurling himself against the lid in what seemed an eternity of cramped, hopeless struggle. He did not hear the sound of footsteps that came hurrying to his aid, and the blows of men with chisels and hammers on the heavy lid were mingled indistinguishably with his own cries and clamorings. Even when the lid was wrenched loose, he had become quite delirious with the horror of it all, and had fought against his rescuers as if they too were part of the suffocating, constrictive nightmare. Never was he able to believe that his experience had been a matter of few minutes only, that he had awakened just after the depositing of the coffin in the vault, and before the actual lowering of the slab and the departure of the pallbearers, whose horrified attention he had attracted by the muted sound of his cries and struggles. It seemed to him that he must have fought there for immeasurable cycles. The shock had left him with shattered nerves that trembled uncontrollably, nerves that found a secret terror, a funereal alarm in the most innocent, unshadowed things. 3 years had gone by since then, but at no time had he been able to master his grisly obsession, to climb from the night-bound pit of his demoralization. His old fear of death was complicated by a new dread that his illness, recurring as it was likely to do, would again take the deceptive semblance of death, and again he would awaken in the tomb. With the ceaseless apprehension of a hypochondriac, he watched for the first repetition of the malady's preliminary symptoms and felt himself irretrievably doomed from their beginning. His fear had poisoned everything, had even parted from him Alice Margreave. There had been no formal breaking of the engagement, merely a tacit falling apart of the self-preoccupied, self-tortured neurotic and the girl whose love had soon turned, perforce, to a bewildered and horror-mingled pity. After that, he had abandoned himself more fully, if possible, to his monomania. He had read everything he could find on the subject of premature interment. He had collected clippings that told of known cases, people who had been rescued in time, or whose reanimation had been detected too late, perhaps had been surmised only from some change or contortion of posture noticed after many years in the removal of the body to a new burial place. Impelled by a shivering fascination, he delved without restraint in the full ghastliness of the abominable theme, and always, in the fate of others, he saw his own fate, and their sufferings, by some vicarious visitation, became his. Fatally convinced that the insufferable horror would recur, he had made elaborate precautions, equipping the casket in which he was to be buried with an electrical device that would summon help. The least pressure of a button within easy reach of his right hand would set an alarm going to ringing in the family chapel above, together with a second gong in the nearby manor house. Even this, however, did little to assuage his fears. He was haunted by the idea that the push button might fail to work, or that no one would hear it, or that his rescuers might arrive too late when he had undergone the full agonies of asphyxiation. These dismal apprehensions, growing more dolorous and more tyrannous daily, had accompanied the first stages of his second illness. Then, by vacillating degrees, he had begun to doubt his brother, to suspect that Guy, being next in the line of inheritance, might wish for his demise, and have an interest in its consummation. Guy had always been a cynical, cold-blooded sort, and his half-concealed contempt and scant sympathy for Uther Magbane's obsession was readily translated into darker terms by a sick fantasy. Gradually, as he grew weaker, the invalid had come to fear that his brother would deliberately hasten the burial, might even disconnect the device for summoning aid whose care had been confided to him. Now, after Guy had gone out, the certainty of such treachery, like a black and noxious blossom, leaped full-grown in Sir Uther Magbane's mind. Swept by a cold, devastating panic, he resolved that he would speak at the first opportunity to someone else, would confide secretly to another person than Guy the responsibility of seeing that the electrical alarm was kept in good working order. Hours went by in a shrouded file as he lay there with his poisonous and sepulchral thoughts. It was afternoon, and the sloping sun should have shone now through the leaded panes, but the yew-fringed sky beyond the window seemed to be overcast, and there was only a sodden glimmering. Twilight began to weave a gray web in the room, and Magbane remembered that it was almost time for the doctor's evening visit. Could he dare confide in the doctor, he wondered? He did not know the man very well. The family physician had died some time ago, and this new doctor had been called in by Guy. Sir Uther had never cared much for his manner, which was both brisk and saturnine. He might be in league with Guy, might have an understanding as to the way in which the elder brother could be so conveniently disposed of, and his demise made certain. Now he could not speak to the doctor. Who was there to help him anyway? He had never made many friends, and even these seemed to have deserted him. The manor house was in a lonely part of the country, and everything would facilitate the treachery that he apprehended. My God, he was being smothered, buried alive. Someone opened the door quietly and came toward him. He felt so hopeless and helpless that he did not even try to turn. Presently the visitor stood before him, and he saw that it was Holton, the aged family butler who had served 3 generations of the Magbanes. Probably he could trust Holton, and he would speak about the matter now. He framed the words with which he would address the butler and was horrified when his tongue and his lips refused to obey him. He had not noticed anything wrong heretofore. His brain and his senses had been preternaturally clear, but now an icy paralysis appeared to have seized his organs of articulation. He tried to lift his pale, claw-like hand and beckon to Holton, but the hand lay moveless on the counterpane, in spite of the agonized and Herculean effort of will which he exerted. Fully conscious, but powerless to stir by so much as the shifting of a finger or the drooping of an eyelid, he could only lie and watch the dawning concern in the old butler's rheumy eyes. Holton came nearer, reaching out his tremulous hand. Magbane saw the hand approaching him, saw it hover above his body, descend toward his heart, just below the direct focus of his vision. It seemed never to reach him, at least there was no sensation of contact. The room was dimming rapidly. Strange that the darkness should have come so soon, and a faintness was creeping on all his senses like an insidious mist. With a start of familial terror and a feeling of some intolerable repetition of doing what he had once done before under circumstances of dire fright, he felt that he was going down into a night-black abyss. Holton's face was fading to a remote star, was receding with awful velocity above unscalable pits at whose bottom nameless, inexorable doom awaited Magbane, a doom to which he had gone at some previous time and which he had been predestined to meet from the beginning of cycles. Down, forever down, he went. The star disappeared. There was no light anywhere, and his syncope was complete. Magbane's reviving consciousness took the form of a fantastic dream. In this dream, he remembered his descent into the gulf, and he thought that the descent had been prolonged after a dim interval by some animate, malignant agency. Great demoniac hands had seemed to grasp him in the nadir-founded gloom, had lifted him, had carried him down immeasurable flights of inframundane stairs and along corridors that lay deeper than hell itself. There was night everywhere. He could not see the forms of those who bore him, supporting him at feet and head, but he could hear their implacable, unceasing steps, echoing with hollow and sepulchral thunder in the black subterranes, and he could sense the funereal towering of their shapes, oppressing him from about and above in some ultra-tactual fashion, such as is possible only in dreams. Somewhere in that nether night they laid him down, they left him and went away. In his dream he heard the departing rumble of their footsteps, with leaden reverberations, endless and ominous, through all the stairs and corridors by which they had come with their human burden. At last there was a prolonged clangor as of closing doors somewhere in the upper profound, a clangor fraught with unutterable despair like the knell of Titans. After its echoes had died away, the despair seemed to remain, stagnant and soundless, dwelling tyrannically, illimitably, in all the recesses of this sepulchral underworld. Silence, dank, stifling Ionian silence, prevailed, as if the whole universe had died, had gone down to some infraspatial burial. Magbane could neither move nor breathe, and he felt by no physical sense an infinity of dead things about him, lying hopeless of resurrection like himself. Then, within the dream, by no perceptible transition, another dream was intercalated. Magbane forgot the horror and hopelessness of his descent, as a newborn child might forget some former death. He thought that he was standing in a place of soft sunlight and blithe, many-tinted flowers. An April turf was deep and resilient beneath him. The heavens were those of some vernal paradise, and he was not alone in this Eden, for Alice Margreave, his former fiancée, stood lovely and smiling amid the nearer blossoms. He stepped toward her, filled with ineffable happiness, and in the sward at his feet a black pit, shaped like the grave, opened and widened and deepened with awful rapidity. Powerless to avert his doom, he went down into the pit, falling interminably, and the darkness closed above him, swooping from all sides on a dim pinpoint of light, which was all that remained of the April heavens. The light expired, and Magbane was lying once more among dead things in vaults beneath the universe. By slow, incalculably doubtful gradations, his dream began to merge into reality. At first, there had been no sense of time, only an ebon stagnation, in which aeons and minutes were equally drowned. Then, through what channel of sense he knew not, there returned to Magbane the awareness of duration. The awareness sharpened, and he thought that he heard at long, regular intervals a remote and muffled sound. Insufferable doubt and bewilderment, associated with some horror which he could not recall, awoke and brooded noxiously in his dark mind. Now he became aware of bodily discomfort. A dank chill, beginning as if in his very brain, crept downward through his body and limbs, till it reached his extremities and left them tingling. He felt, too, that he was intolerably cramped, was lying in some stiff, straightened position. With mounting terror, for which as yet he could find no name, he heard the remote, muffled sound draw closer, till it was in his own body, and it was no longer a sound, but the palpable hammering of his heart against his side. With this clarifying of his sense perceptions, he knew, abruptly, as in a flash of black lightning, the thing of which he was afraid. The terrible knowledge went through him in a lethal shock, leaving him frozen. It was like a titanic rigor oppressing all his members, constricting his throat and heart as with iron bands, inhibiting his breath, crushing him like some material incubus. He dared not, could not move to verify his fear. Utterly unmanned by a conviction of atrocious doom, he fought to regain some nominal degree of composure. He must not give way to the horror, or he would go mad. Perhaps it was only a dream after all. Perhaps he was lying awake in his own bed, in darkness, and if he reached out his hand, he would encounter free space, not the hideous nearness of a coffin lid. In a sick vertigo of irresolution, he tried to summon courage and volition for the test. His sense of smell, awakening now, tended to confirm his despair, for there was a musty closeness, a dismal, sodden reek of wood and cloth, even as once before. It seemed to grow heavier momently with confined impurities. At first he thought that he could not move his hand, that the strange paralysis of his malady had not yet left him. With the dread laboriousness of nightmare, he lifted it slowly, tediously, as if overcoming the obstruction of a viscid medium. When, finally, a few inches away, it met the cold, straight surface he had apprehended, he felt the iron tightening of his despair, but was not surprised. There had been no real room for hope. The thing was happening again, just as it had been ordained to happen. Every step he had taken since birth, every motion, every breath, every struggle, had led only to this. Mad thoughts were milling in his brain like crowded maggots in a corpse. Old memories and present fears were mingled in strange confusion, steeped with the same charnel blackness. He recalled in that tumult of disconnected ideas the push button he had installed in the casket. At the same moment, his brother's face, callous, ironic, touched with a thin, ambiguous sneer, appeared like a hallucination from the darkness, and the newest of his fears came back upon him with sickening certitude. In a flash, he saw the face presiding above the entire process through which, by the illegal connivance of the doctor, he must have been hurried into the tomb without passing through an embalmer's hands. Fearing that he might revive at any moment, they had taken no chances and had doomed him to this horror. The mocking face, the cruel vision seemed to disappear, and among his disordered, frenzy-driven thoughts there rose an irrational hope. Perhaps he had been wrong in his doubts of Guy. Perhaps the electrical device would work after all, and a light pressure would summon eager hands to loose him from his mortuary confinement. He forgot the ghastly chain of condemning logic. Quickly, by an automatic impulse, he groped for the button. At first he did not find it, and a sick consternation filled him. Then, at last, his fingers touched it, and he pressed the button again and again, listening desperately for the answering clang of the alarm gong in the chapel above. Surely he would hear it, even through the intervening wooden stone, and he tried insanely to believe that he had heard it, that he could even hear the sound of running footsteps somewhere above him. After seeming hours, with a hideous lapse into the most abominable despond, he realized that there was nothing but the stifled clamor of his own imprisoned heart. For a while he yielded to madness, as on that former occasion, beating obliviously against the sides of the casket, hurling himself blindly at the inexorable lid. He shrieked again and again, and the narrow space seemed to drown him with a volume of thick, demoniacally deep sound which he did not recognize as his own voice or the voice of anything human. Exhaustion and the warm, salty taste of blood in his mouth flowing from his bruised face brought him back, at last, to comparative calmness. He perceived now that he was breathing with great difficulty, that his violent struggles and cries had served only to deplete the scant amount of air in the casket. In a moment of unnatural coolness, he recalled something that he had read somewhere about a method of shallow breathing by which men could survive protracted periods of inhumation. He must force himself to inhale lightly, must center all his faculties on the prolongation of life. Perhaps, even yet, if he could hold out, his rescuers would come. Perhaps the alarm had rung, and he had not been able to hear it. Men were hurrying to his aid, and he must not perish before they could lift the slab and break open the casket. He wanted to live as never before. He longed with intolerable avidity to breathe the open air once more, to know the unimaginable bliss of free movement and respiration. Christ, if someone would only come, if he could hear the ring of footsteps, the sullen grating of the slab, the hammers and chisels that would let in the blessed light, the pure air. Was this all that he could ever know, this dumb horror of living interment, this blind, cramped agony of slow suffocation? He strove to breathe quietly, with no waste or effort, but his throat and chest seemed to constrict as with the inexorable tightening of some atrocious torture instrument. There was no relief, no escape, nothing but a ceaseless, relentless pressure, the strangling clutch of some monstrous garrote that compressed his lungs, his heart, his windpipe, his very brain. The agony increased. There was a weight of piled monuments upon him which he must lift if he were to breathe freely. He strove against the funereal burden. He seemed to hear at the same time the labored sound of some cyclopean engine that sought to make headway in a subterranean passage beneath fallen masses of earth and stone. He did not know that the sound was his own tortured gasping. The engine seemed to pant, thunderous and stertorous, with earth-shaking vibrations, and upon it, he thought, the foundations of ruined worlds were descending slowly and steadily to choke it into ultimate silence. The last agonies of his asphyxiation were translated into a monstrous delirium, a phantasmagoria that seemed to prolong itself for cycles, with one implacable dream passing without transition into another. He thought that he was lying captive in some inquisitorial vault whose roof, floor, and walls were closing upon him with appalling speed, were crushing him in their adamantine embrace. For an instant, in a light that was not light, he strove to flee with leaden limbs from a formless, nameless juggernaut, taller than the stars, heavier than the world, that rolled upon him in black iron silence, grinding him beneath it into the charnel dust of some nethermost limbo. He was climbing eternal stairs, bearing in his arms the burden of some gigantic corpse, only to have the stairs crumble beneath him at each step and to fall back with the corpse lying upon him and swelling to macrocosmic proportions. Eyeless giants had stretched him prone on a granite plain and were building upon his chest, block by colossal block, through eons of slow toil, the black babble of a sunless world. An anaconda of black living metal, huger than the python of myth, coiling about him in the pit where he had fallen, constricted his body with its unimaginable folds. In a gray, livid flash, he saw its enormous mouth poised above him, sucking the last breath it had squeezed from his lungs. With inconceivable swiftness, the head of the anaconda became that of his brother Guy. It mocked him with a vast sneer. It appeared to swell and expand, to lose all human semblance or proportion, to become a blank, dark mass that rushed upon him in cyclonic gloom, driving him down into the space beyond space. Somewhere in that descent, there came to him the incognizable mercy of nothingness. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.